Welcome to Restoria. I'm Arthur, and this is your quiet place for gentle bedtime stories. Get comfortable, take a breath, and let the story slow your thoughts and ease you softly into sleep. Freya's cats in the long winter. The snow had been falling since before the light came, and the light, when it came, was the color of milk. It lay over the meadow and the low hills beyond and the roof of the hall, and it went on falling, unhurried, each flake taking its own time down through the grey air. Inside the hall, the fire had been burning all night and burned still, settled now into a deep bed of coals with low flames moving over them. That was the sound of the morning. The small tick and settle of the wood, the breath of the flame, and beyond the walls, the wide hush of snow coming down on snow. The hall stood by itself at the edge of the meadow they called Folkvanga, the field of the people, a low building of grey timber with turf grown thick over its roof. In summer, the meadow ran gold with grass to the knee, and the doors stood open from dawn until the late northern dusk. Now the grass slept under the snow, and the doors were shut against the cold, and the hall had drawn into itself the way a creature draws into its own heat in winter. One window near the hearth had been left unshuttered. Through it the snow showed, falling and falling, and the light it let in was pale and even, and asked nothing of the eyes. By the hearth, on a wide sheepskin gone the color of old cream, the two cats lay sleeping. They were larger than house cats, long in the body and thick through the shoulder, built for the harness and the open road of the sky. One was grey, the deep grey of a winter sea, with darker rings barely showing along its flanks. The other was the pale gold of ripe barley, near to white where the firelight did not reach it. They lay against one another, the grey one's head tucked under the gold one's chin, and they rose and fell together with their breathing, two slow tides keeping the same time. Freya moved about the hall in the early hush, doing the small things that fill the start of a winter day. She wore wool the color of heather, and her feet were bare on the boards, and she went without hurry from the wood store to the hearth and back, building the fire up for the day ahead. She was not as the stories far to the south would later make her, all gold and battle and longing. Here in her own hall, in the deep of the year, she was simply the keeper of a warm place while the world outside lay under snow. The cats knew her step and did not wake for it. They had heard it every morning of 100 winters. In the season of grass and long light, the cats worked. They drew her chariot across the sky and over the meadows, the harness creaking, their great paws finding purchase on the air the way a swimmer finds it in water. She rode behind them through the gold afternoons, over the fields of the living and the quiet field of the resting, and the cats pulled tirelessly because the pulling was theirs to do, and they loved the doing of it. But that was summer. In winter, the chariot stood in the outbuilding under a cloth, its wheels still, and the harness hung from its peg by the door, the leather gone stiff with cold, and the cats slept. This was the gift of the winter, and they took it fully. Through the whole bright season they had run, and now they rested, and there was no guilt in the resting, and no restlessness either. Through the whole bright season they had run, and now they rested, and there was no guilt in the resting, and no restlessness either. It does not measure the hours it sleeps against the hours it might have worked. It gives itself wholly to the heat and the weight of its own body, and it sinks and it stays. Freya had learned a great deal from her cats over the winters, and this was the first of it: how to rest without asking the rest to be anything more than rest. She crouched by the hearth and laid 2 split logs across the coals, birch with the white bark still on it, and the bark caught and curled and threw a brighter light up the walls for a moment before settling. The smell of birch smoke moved through the hall, clean and a little sweet. Under it lay the other smells of the place, the ones that never left through the winter: wool and tallow. Dried herbs hung in bunches from the beams, meadowsweet and thyme gathered in the summer she had ridden out to find them, the dusty, close smell of the sheepskins, and always, low and animal and good, the smell of the 2 cats themselves, who carried summer in their fur the way a stone carries the heat of the sun into the evening. The grey cat's paws moved in its sleep. They worked at the air, loose and soundless, the claws sheathing and unsheathing, and a sound came from deep in its chest that was not quite a purr and not quite a word. It was dreaming of the running, perhaps, of the harness and the open sky and the meadow streaming away beneath, or perhaps of nothing that could be named, only the pure motion of a body made for motion, going on with its work even in the depth of its rest. After a moment, the pause stilled. The cat let out a breath through its nose, settled its chin more firmly against the gold one's flank, and went down again into the place beneath dreaming. The gold cat stirred at that, lifted its head a hand's breadth, and looked at the fire with eyes gone to slits in the brightness. It held there a moment, deciding nothing, simply being awake in the firelit room with the snow at the window. Then it yawned, a great unhurried opening of the jaws that showed the pink-ridged roof of its mouth, and it stretched one foreleg out across the sheepskin with the toes spread wide, and it drew the leg back, and it laid its head down on the grey one's shoulder and closed its eyes. The whole of it took the time it took. Nothing in the cat was in any hurry to be done. Nothing in the cat was in any hurry to be done. Freya took up her spindle and sat on the bench near the hearth where the light was best. The wool she was spinning was the gold of the meadow in its high summer, and as she drew it out and let the spindle turn, it became a thread finer than grass, winding down and down toward the floor. She spun without watching her hands. Her hands knew the work without her, the draw and the twist and the wind, and her eyes were free to rest on the fire, or the snow, or the 2 sleeping shapes on the skin before the hearth. The spindle turned. The thread grew. The morning moved through the hall as slow and certain as the snow coming down outside. There was nowhere she had to be. That was the truth the winter laid bare each year, the truth the summer was too full and bright to hold. In the bright season, there was always the next field, the next ride, the next thing the world asked of her. The winter asked nothing. It closed the doors and banked the fire and said, "Now you may simply be here, in this room, with these small lives, and let the year turn without your pushing it." She had not always known how to receive that. In her younger winters, she had paced the hall and fretted at the shut doors and longed for the grass. The cats had taught her better, season by season, until she had learned to sit as they sat and let the snow fall and ask nothing of the day but that it pass gently. The snow did not let up through the morning. It came down past the unshuttered window in its countless brief descents and where it met the glass, it gathered at the corners in soft ridges that climbed by the hour. Freya rose once to look out at it, the spindle resting in her hand. The meadow had gone, the hills had gone, the line where the land met the sky had gone. There was only the white, near and far at once, falling out of nothing into nothing, filling the world so completely that it made the firelit room behind her feel like the one solid thing left, a hall of firelight, afloat in a sea of falling white. Out there, under the snow, lay the field of the resting. In the bright half of the year they came to her, those who had set down the labor of their lives and earned a place in the quiet meadow, and she rode out among them and saw that the field held them well. They were not troubled in Folkvang. It was a gentle place, a field of grass and wandering rivers, and the kind of evening light that never quite goes. And in winter they rested as the cats rested, as the grass rested, as the whole turning world rested, under the same snow that fell on the roof of her hall. There was no sorrow in it. Rest was not a sad thing here. Rest was the reward the field was made to give. She turned back to the fire and the cats and the lit room that held them. The thought of the field did not weigh on her. She had kept it for longer than the snow had a name, and she had come to feel about it the way a shepherd feels about a hill where the flock lies safe, a steady tending, a watchfulness without worry. Those in her field were at peace. She had only to let them be at peace, and to keep her own hall warm, and to let the winter do its work of stilling everything until the year was ready to turn again toward the light. When the fire had burned a while, she fetched the shallow clay dish from the shelf and poured into it a little cream from the crock by the cold wall. She set it down on the hearthstone where the warmth would take the chill from it, and she said nothing, and she did not need to. The gold cat's ear turned first, before its eyes had even opened, tracking the wet sound of the cream against the clay. Then both cats were awake, in the unhurried way of well-fed creatures who know the cream is not going anywhere. They rose and arched and stepped down off the sheepskin, one after the other, and came to the dish with their tails held high. They drank side by side, their pink tongues working, the lapping the one sound in the hall, but for the fire. The grey one finished first and sat back and washed its face with one paw, circles over the ear and the cheek. The gold one took the last of the cream and then washed too, and for a while the two of them sat on the heated stone, grooming themselves with great care, as though the day held no task more pressing than the cleanness of their own fur. And it did not. That was the whole shape of the winter day. Sleep and cream and the washing of fur, and sleep again, and the fire kept burning through it all. Their work done, they did not go back to the sheepskin at once. The gold cat came instead to where Freya sat, and pressed its broad head against her shin, once, twice, and then turned and pressed its whole length along her leg, the tail curling last around her ankle. She set down the spindle and ran her hand along its back, from the ears to the base of the tail, and the cat leaned into the stroke, and a deep purr started up in it, loud in the quiet hall. The grey one came too, then, unwilling to be left out of any comfort that was going, and pushed its head under her other hand. She sat between the two of them with a hand on each, and the purring filled the room, low and even, the sound a hall makes when it is content. That sound was the center of the winter, if the winter could be said to have one. Not the fire, though the fire mattered, not the snow, though the snow set the frame. It was the purr of the two cats, that rolling burr low in the chest of each, the sound of a creature so at ease in its own body that the ease spilled out of it and into the air and into the hands that touched it. When the cats purred, the hall was well. Freya had come to measure her winters by it, the way another might measure by the calendar or the turning stars. As long as the cats purred by the fire, all was as it should be, and the cold outside could do its worst. The wind rose toward the middle of the day, as it often did, and drove the snow now in slants past the window. It found the corners of the hall and spoke in them, a low note under the eaves, and it pressed against the shut doors and could not enter. Inside, the contrast only doubled the ease of the room. The fire stood between them and all of it, the wind and the white and the cold that had no end. Freya fed the flames another length of birch and watched the bark catch, and the two cats, having had their cream and their stroking, climbed back onto the sheepskin and folded themselves into one another and let the wind sing them down towards sleep. In the outbuilding across the yard, under its cloth, the chariot waited out the season. She thought of it now and then through the winter, not with longing, but with a kind of fondness, the way you think of a good tool set by until its time comes round. Its wheels were banded with worn bronze, and its bed was lined with fleece for the open rides, and the harness that fitted the cats hung by the door, two collars of soft leather worked with silver, made to sit easy on those great shoulders. In spring, she would oil the leather and grease the axle and lead the cats out blinking into the new light. But that was a good way off, and it did not press on her. Spring would come when it came. The winter had its own length to run first, and she would let it run. At what passed for midday in that pale season, she ate a little, standing by the hearth. Bread from the morning's baking, holding a trace of its own heat, and a bowl of broth kept warm at the fire's edge, barley and roots and the dried meat of the autumn slaughter. She ate without ceremony and gave the last crust to the cats, who took it more for the giving than the eating, the gold one carrying it off to the sheepskin to nose at and ignore. Then she rinsed the bowl in the cold water by the wall and set it to drain, and the small task closed the middle of the day as gently as it had opened. Outside, the snow went on. The light, such as it was, had already begun its early decline. The afternoon was the long middle of the winter day, the stretch of hours with nothing in them and nowhere to go. The fire ticked. The snow fell. Freya sat with her spinning and let her eyes wander the room, over the hung herbs and the dark beams and the two shapes on the sheepskin, and she let her mind wander with them, going nowhere in particular, the way a stream wanders a flat meadow. The cats slept the deep sleep of the early afternoon, the sleep past dreaming, when even the paws lie still. You could have lifted either of them, and they would have hung in your hands like water in a cloth, given over wholly to the rest. They had come to her small, the two of them, in a spring so far back that the meadow had worn out and grown again 100 times since. A gift brought across the far roads by a traveller who knew she kept a hall and might want company in it. They had fit together in the bowl of her two hands then, the grey one and the gold one, eyes barely open, mewing the thin mews of the very young. She had warmed them at this same hearth, in a hall that was newer then, and fed them from a cloth dipped in cream, and watched them find their feet on these same boards. They had been hers ever since, and she theirs, through more winters than either of them could have counted, had cats been the counting kind. She remembered them as kittens tumbling the length of the hall, all ears and feet, chasing the end of her spun thread, climbing the hangings, falling asleep mid-pounce in patches of sun on the floor. They had grown through that first summer faster than seemed possible, lengthening, filling out, the play in them turning by degrees to purpose. By the autumn they were big enough to wear their first harness she had made them, and they had taken to it the way some creatures take to the thing they were born for, without fear, without fuss, leaning into the pull as though they had been waiting all their short lives to be asked. She had wept a little the first time they drew the chariot clear of the ground, not from sorrow, from the sight of them doing the thing they were made to do, for the rides were a wonder, and even now, sitting by the winter fire, she could call them up whole, the harness creaking as the cats took the strain, the ground falling away beneath the bronze-banded wheels, the meadow spreading out below in its summer gold, the rivers threading it in bright lines, the hills rolling off to the edge of seeing, the two cats stretched out ahead of her on the air, the grey and the gold, their great paws reaching and gathering, their tails streaming straight out behind, the wind of the going in her hair. She had ridden the whole bright half of the year that way, over the fields of the living and the field of the resting, and the cats had never once tired of carrying her, because to them it was not labor. It was joy with a harness on. It was joy with a harness on. The chariot itself had been made for her long ago, by hands that knew their craft. The bed of it bent from a single curved length of ash, the wheels banded by a smith who worked the bronze thin and true. It had carried her through so many summers that the ash had darkened with the oil of her hands where she gripped it. In the outbuilding now, it waited under its cloth, and the harness hung by the door, and the silver on the collars had dimmed a little with the cold. She would shine it again when the light came back. There was a pleasure held in waiting to do a thing, she had found, almost as full as the doing. The chariot was not gone. It was only resting as the cats rested, as she rested, until the year turned and asked for it again. Its shadow crossed the pale window, and then a raven settled on the sill outside, shaking the snow from its back. It looked in at the firelit room with one bright eye, head tilted, the way ravens do. One of the old grey wanderer's birds, most likely, outriding the storm on some errand of its master's, stopping to look in on a lit hall on its way. Freya raised a hand to it, and the raven held a moment longer, taking in the fire and the cats and the woman at her spinning. Then it opened its wings and dropped back into the falling snow and was gone, carrying word of a peaceful hall to wherever such words were carried. Neither cat so much as twitched an ear. They had long since judged the ravens beneath their concern. The thread she spun through these winter afternoons was not for nothing. All the cold months she drew it out, fine and gold, winding it into great balls that filled a basket by the wall, and when the basket was full, she would set up the loom and weave. What she wove was a kind of keeping. The gold of the summer meadow spun and stored through the winter, so that even in the depth of the dark, she had the warmth of the bright season running through her fingers. By spring, there would be a length of cloth the color of grass in July, and she would have carried the summer across the winter on a spindle, and that was its own small magic, the oldest kind, the kind that needs no spell beyond patience. The hall around her had been raised in an age she could remember if she reached for it. The great timbers had come from a forest now gone to meadow. dragged and raised and pegged by hands that had loved the building of it. The turf of the roof had been cut from the field itself, so that the whole wore the meadow over its head, grass above and grass below, and in summer small flowers bloomed along the ridgeline. Now the roof lay thick with snow, and the snow kept the heat in better than any thatch, and the old timbers held as they had always held, dark and sound, smelling faintly of the smoke of all the fires that had ever burned beneath them. She thought of the autumn just past, the bringing in of the year, the last rides through the cooling air, the cat's breath showing now in the mornings, the gathering of roots and the drying of herbs and the salting away of the meat. Then the first hard frost, the meadow gone white and brittle one dawn, and she had known the season had turned. She had led the cats in from the cold that evening, and unbuckled the harness and hung it by the door, and they had understood, the way they understood everything that mattered without a word passing, that the running was done for a while, and the long rest had begun. They had gone straight to the hearth. They had been there, more or less, ever since. The first snow of this winter had come 3 weeks back, or thereabouts, in the night, so that she woke to a changed world, the window gone pale, the hall hushed in the particular way a building hushes under fresh snow. Since then it had snowed more days than not. The drifts had risen along the north wall and curved over the lintel of the door, and the path to the outbuilding had to be broken anew each morning. But inside, nothing changed, and that was the gift of it. Inside there was the fire and the cats and the spinning and the cream, the same today as yesterday, the same tomorrow as today, a roundness to the days that asked for no marking of one from the next. She thought this was the deep of the year now, the very bottom of it, the weeks when the light gave least and the cold gave most. In some halls, in some lands, they lit great fires at this turning and feasted against the dark. She kept the turning in her own way, with a single hall and a single fire and 2 cats and a length of gold thread growing daily longer. There was no need for great fires where the whole of the matter was rest. The dark did not frighten her. She had seen it come and go too many times to fear it, and she knew, as surely as she knew her own hands, that it was already, even now, beginning by the smallest of measures to give way. The 2 cats had their places in the hall, learned over the many years and kept to with a cat's exactness. The sheepskin by the hearth was for the deep sleep of the day. The wide bench under the unshuttered window was for the watching of weather when the mood took them. The top of the meal chest, where the heat of the fire pooled under the roof, was for the bitterest mornings. And her own lap, when she sat, was for the evenings, claimed by whichever cat reached it first, though more often than not it was the gold one, who had always been the bolder of the 2 in the seeking of comfort. The grey one preferred the stone, and the heat coming straight off the fire, and its own dignified company. For they were not the same, the 2 of them, however alike they lay when they slept. The grey one was the elder by a few breaths, and carried itself so, watchful, deliberate, loath to give its trust, and loath to take it back once given. The gold one was all ease and appetite, the first to the cream, the first to the lap, the first to roll belly up in a patch of sun without a care for who might see. Between them they made a whole, the watcher and the reveller, and they had worn each other smooth over the centuries, the way 2 stones in a river wear smooth together, until each was shaped to the other, and neither was complete without the warm weight of its brother near. There was a companionship in animals that asked nothing and gave much. The cats did not need her to speak or to explain or to be anything other than the keeper of the place and the giver of the cream. They took her as she was, and she took them as they were, and the three of them passed the winters together in a peace that needed no words to hold it up. She had known the company of gods and of the dead and of the living who passed through her field, and all of it had its place. But there was nothing quite like the company of a sleeping cat on a snowbound afternoon. The trust of it, the ease of it, the steady proof of it that all was well. Beyond the wall, the meadow lay under its blanket, the grass that ran gold in summer now bowed and sleeping beneath the snow. It was not dead. She knew that, as a keeper of growing things must know it. Down under the white, down in the dark of the soil, the roots held their life close and waited, gathering themselves in patience for the spring. Its whole meadow was doing in its way exactly what the cats were doing on the sheepskin, what she was doing on the bench, what the buried rivers and the bare hills and the sleeping field of the resting were all doing alike. Holding on. Keeping the small fire of life banked low under the ash of the winter, enough to last, enough to wake to. The rivers of her field had frozen weeks ago, the broad ones first, and then the quick. She had ridden out once at the start of the freeze, before the snow grew too deep for the chariot, and seen them go still and white under the grey sky. The field of the resting lay hushed under its snow, as everything lay quiet, and those who rested there rested on, undisturbed by the cold, for the cold could not reach them where they were. It was a good field in winter, she had always thought, a field made for exactly this, for the laying down of burdens and the long, untroubled sleep, white and still from edge to edge, holding its people gently while the year went round. She had kept that field and this hall through more winters than she could put a number to. The count had stopped mattering long ago. When you have seen the snow come 1,000 times, you stop tallying the storms and start simply living inside them, one at a time, each one whole and sufficient in itself. This winter was not a winter among others. It was the only winter, the way each is the only one while it lasts. The fire the only fire, the cats the only cats, the falling snow the one snow that had ever fallen. She had learned that too from the animals, who knew nothing of the winters before, and cared nothing for the winters to come, and lived, therefore, entirely and always in the one that held them. The hall in the afternoon had a smell all its own, and she breathed it now without naming it, the way you breathe the air of the place you most belong. Wood smoke first and over everything. Then the herbs, and the wool, and the tallow of the unlit lamp. The cream gone faintly sour in its dish on the cold shelf. The fleeces, the cats, and under all of it, the smell of the old timbers themselves, of stone and turf and the smoke of ages, the smell of a hall that had stood a long time and meant to stand a good while yet. It was the smell of safety, if safety has a smell. It was the smell of nowhere she needed to be but here. The light at the window had begun, by the slightest degrees, to fail. It was hard to mark in weather like this, where the day was never bright to start with, but she could feel the going of it, the white past the glass thickening toward grey, the corners of the hall reaching out their shadows a little further than before. The cats felt it too, in whatever way cats feel such things. The grey one rolled from its side onto its belly, gathered its paws beneath it, and settled into the loaf shape they take when the heat grows precious. The gold one slept on, but drew itself a little tighter against the grey. The day was turning down toward its close, and the hall turned with it, the way it always did, without hurry, without regret. She rose to tend the fire before the dark came on in earnest. It had burned low through the dim afternoon of her sitting, and she crossed to the wood store and brought back an armful of birch and laid 2 more lengths across the coals. They caught, and the light leapt up the walls again, and the cat's fur shone gold and silver in the new brightness, for a moment before the flames settled to their steady burning. She stood by the hearth a while, with her hands held out to the heat, feeling it come into her palms and up her arms, and then she sat again on the bench and took up the spindle and let the evening begin to gather the hall into its quiet. The dark came early in that country and came on without drama, the white of the day thickening toward grey and the grey toward a deep blue that pressed at the window. Freya lit the lamp that hung from the central beam, a shallow bowl of fish oil with a wick of twisted flax, and a small steady flame stood up in it and threw a second, gentler light to keep the fire company. The hall held 2 lights now, the red of the hearth and the gold of the lamp, and between them the shadows of the beams lay soft across the turf roof. The cats had not moved. The early dark meant nothing to them, but a deepening of the dark they already carried in their closed eyes, and they slept on through the lighting of the lamp as they had slept through the falling of the day. With the lamp lit and the broth eaten and the snow coming down, the evening drew the hall in closer around its 2 lights. Freya took up the spindle again for a while, then let it rest. There was a point in every winter evening when even the spinning felt like too much asking of the hands, and the right thing was simply to sit, and she had learned to find that point and to honor it. She set the spindle in its basket. She drew a fleece around her shoulders. She sat on the bench by the hearth with her hands open in her lap and let the fire have her eyes. The cold deepened, as it always did once the light was gone, finding its way along the floor, pressing harder at the doors. The cats felt it before she did. First the grey one rose, turned a circle, and came down again nearer the hearthstone, close enough that the firelight lay full along its flank. Then the gold one followed, but the gold one did not stop at the stone. It crossed to the bench and looked up at her once, and flowed up into her lap in a single unhurried movement, settling its weight across her knees and tucking its paws beneath its chest. The weight of it was a good weight. A cat at rest in the lap is heavier than its size, as though in giving itself to sleep it gives its share of the earth's own pull as well. Freya rested her hands on the gold fur and felt the heat of the animal come up through it into her palms, and felt the breathing lift and fall, and felt the purr begin again, quieter now, a thing more felt than heard. She did not stroke it. She only let her hands lie where they had fallen, and let the warmth pass between them, hers into the cat's into her, until there was no telling whose it had been to start with. The grey cat slept on the stone, with its back to the fire and its face to the room. Now and then the firelight found a half-open eye, a thin line of green, and then the eye closed again, and there was only the dark shape of it against the glow. The 2 of them held the hearth between them, the one in her lap and the one on the stone, and Freya sat held in the middle, the fleece on her shoulders and the cat on her knees, and the fire in front of her, and the snow at her back beyond the wall, wrapped around 3 times over, by the cats, by the fire, by the hall, by the snow that shut the world out, and the snug dark inn. She thought in the loose way one thinks when no thought is needed, of the turning of the year. The light had gone as far down as it would go, or near enough. Soon, though not yet, the days would begin their slow climb back, a few minutes at first, so little you could not feel it, and then more, until one morning the meadow would show a green edge through the white, and the snow would start to leave. It always came back. In all her hundreds of winters, it had never once failed to come back. There was a great quiet certainty in that, and she let it settle on her, along with the weight of the cat, the sure return of the light in its own time, asking nothing of her but that she wait. The fire was burning down now. She had stopped feeding it when the evening turned, and the flames had sunk into the coals, and the coals glowed deep red and orange under a soft skin of ash. The light in the hall lowered with it, the bright reach up the walls drawing back, the shadows growing kind and large. It was the best light of the day, this low ember light, the light a room comes to when it is ready to rest. The lamp on the beam burned on above it, small and gold and steady, keeping its little watch over the sleeping hall. After a time, she lifted the gold cat, carefully, the way you lift something you do not want to wake, and set it down on the sheepskin beside the grey one. It barely roused. It found the grey one's heat by feel and curled into it, nose to flank, and the 2 of them lay once more as they had lain at the start of the day, 2 tides breathing in the same slow time. Freya knelt at the hearth and banked the fire for the night, drawing the ash up over the coals to hold their heat until morning, the way she had banked it 10,000 times before. The embers dimmed under the ash to a low red murmur, enough to keep the cold at bay, enough to wake to. The wind had eased while she was not listening. When she stood and went to the window, the snow was falling, but gently now, straight down, the slants and the under eaves singing gone out of it. It came down past the glass in the last of the ember light, each flake catching a little of the red as it passed, and then losing it to the dark below. The drifts had climbed high against the wall. By morning, the door would have to be pushed against their weight. But that was morning's task, and morning was a good way down through the night, and there was nothing now to do but let the night arrive. This winter, she lay down on the long bench by the hearth, the fleece over her, in the place she slept through the cold months, to be near the fire and the cats. The boards were familiar under her. The gliss held her heat. Across the small distance, the 2 cats slept on their skin, and she could hear them, the faint double rhythm of their breathing, the last of the purr ebbing away as the gold one went fully under. The hall was very quiet. Only the faint settle of the banked fire now, and the breath of the cats, and far off and soft the endless falling of the snow. The lamp on the beam burned lower. The flax wick had drawn the oil down through the evening, and the flame stood smaller now, a single bead of gold under the dark roof. They did not go out. It only grew small and steady and kept its place. Below it, the embers held their red heat under the grey ash, breathing out their warmth into the room a little at a time, all night long, asking nothing in return. The grey cat sighed in its sleep and was still. The gold cat's paw lay over the grey one's, the two sets of claws sheathed and at rest. Outside, the snow came down on the meadow and the hills and the field of those who rested, covering all of it the same, white on white, soft on soft, the whole world tucked in under the one blanket. And the hall stood in the middle of it, with its banked fire and its steady lamp, holding its two sleeping cats and its keeper, a warm, dark room afloat in the falling white. The fire murmured low. The lamp held its small gold. The cats breathed their two breaths into one, and the snow went on falling past the window, patient and endless and kind, settling over the wide meadow, settling over the roof, settling the whole of the winter world down into its rest, while inside the embers glowed on under the ash, red and quiet, keeping the night.